I'm going to start by calling the roll. Wayne Creedle.
Here.
Benny Gates. Philip Hart.
Here.
Donna James. Dave Johannes.
Yep.
Preston Lloyd. Kendra Norrell. Michelle Parrott. Maritza Peachin. Here. Brian White.
Here.
Charlie Wilson.
Here.
Roger York.
Here.
Thank you. We have received a request from Ms. Casey Overton and Mr. Eric Mai to participate in the meeting virtually. Casey has a work retreat and Eric has a medical issue. So I will need a motion. We'll take separate motions. We'll start with Ms. Overton first. I need a motion to approve Ms. Overton participating virtually. So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. And we can take have a motion to approve Mr. Mai's participation virtually. Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Great. So Casey and Eric, can you hear us okay? Let's see, Eric. Okay, all right, great. So thank you all for joining us today. This is the Advisory Council, which is a subcommittee of the City Planning Commission. We're charged with advising the Planning Commission, the Department of Planning and Development Review, and the consultant team in the zoning ordinance revision process. The public will have an opportunity to speak at the beginning of the meeting on matters that are not already on the agenda. But before we move to that, I'd like to get approval of the November meeting notes. Hopefully you've all had a time to read those that were sent out by staff. We had a motion and a second. We're happy to take any questions if there are any. All right, we have a motion and a second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. So this time we will start with public comment. And again, this is an item for the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda. So we'll start with those that are in the room first. We want to be mindful of our timing here because we've got a pretty lengthy agenda. So we're going to try to keep comments to around 3 to 4 minutes per person. So with that, is there anyone in the room that would like to start with the comments? Sure. You raise your hand first. Come on up.
Okay. Thanks. I'm Joseph Carlisle, RDA DMV. Just want to say that I want to stress just how important this zoning rewrite is for Richmond's future by creating a more relaxed and flexible zoning code across all sectors of the city. Will enable the kind of dense, sustainable development that makes neighborhoods vibrant, walkable, and less reliant on cars. This is about building a city that works better for everyone. Right now, we're facing a high housing crisis. Families are struggling to find affordable places to live, and the cost of housing continues to rise. The best way we can address this is by ensuring that this zoning rewrite allows for more housing. We need more apartments, townhomes, multiplexes, and ADUs to be allowed by right throughout the city. We need more diverse housing types to meet the needs of all residents at whatever income level they are at. Relaxing zoning regulations will also unlock opportunities for new businesses and community amenities to flourish alongside housing. A city where homes, jobs, schools, and services are closer together is not only more affordable, but also more desirable for people of all ages and backgrounds. This is once in a generation opportunity to shape Richmond's growth in a way that makes it more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. Let's make sure we get it right the first time.
Thank you. Mr. Rollinger?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to be here tonight. I think all of you have seen my green line of the stuff from the last meeting, and I wanted to just give a quick, since I only have a limited amount of time, more context to some of the comments I made. One of the things that I at the meeting last month, and I haven't been to ones prior to that, I'm still looking to figure out how this zoning rewrite really plugs into Richmond 300. Maybe you already talked about that, but in my way of thinking, as we developed Richmond 300, there were 2 items that I think really help propel us towards the future. That's the concept of the nodes, and that's the concept of how we treat CoRe. And I don't see yet the nexus between some of the zoning categories that have been put together and how we create great nodes in the city. So that is something that maybe will come up, but I would like to bring it to everybody's attention because it's not immediately relevant. Everybody deserves a great neighborhood, and I think we can create those great neighborhoods at nodes and along corridors, especially U.S. highways, a highway corridor, if you think about them more comprehensively. I don't get the block analysis, but maybe that'll become clear to me later because, again, I think the idea of the plan being a look forward, we spent a lot of time last week looking backwards. I think we need to show more of everybody in the city. I don't think we see enough of places south of the river. And in fact, 8 of the 10 districts shown for the analysis are north of the river. So if I can't see myself in the plan, what does that say to me? And I think that's very important. I do have a second point that I do want to talk about South Richmond. It's a huge part of the city. And again, as I look at the illustrations and some of the discussion, I'm just not sure that and I think Mary Ann has told me that they're spending more time in South Richmond. We need to look at that. Last thing, because it came up last meeting and I heard some comments about it this afternoon, I would like to spend 2 minutes or 1 minute talking about the landscape. I think the landscape in the city of Richmond is important. And I think, and as a Midwesterner, the motto for the city of Chicago is herbs and hortus, city and a garden. And what I think we need to do is we continue to think, and I live in the R5 district where I have real concerns about what is shown in that last presentation. We keep pitching green space, personal private green space in the city and some of the recommendations. I'll give you the perfect example. It came up Chamberlain Avenue. Why do we want big setbacks along Chamberlain Avenue? And I think there's 2 answers to that. Number one, I think some of the architecture of some of the infill, the apartment buildings on Chamberlain is not as good as it could have been. There are buildings along Chamberlain that I think fit quite nicely. I lived for 6 years on East Main Street. I don't know why anybody would want to live closer to East Main as opposed to a little further from East Main, and I do that with Chamberlain. The third thing is, even though I said there were 2, there's actually probably 3 and 4. The third thing is, I'm so old, I remember when planning schools talked about cross sections. And we talked building face to building face. And as the city has matured and we deal with things like Dominion and others, the ability to establish an urban forest in the public realm is getting squeezed all the time. So if we don't have the ability to put that in the public realm, where do we put it? Put it in the private realm. We allow people to put it in the private. That's why ideas like 15-foot setbacks, then you got a 6-foot porch, then all of a sudden you're under 10 feet. You're not going to get a tree in there that will thrive. And so the idea is, how do we maximize that cross section for the provision of opportunities for green space in the city? Don't look at that when we just look at a parcel by parcel aspect of it. We got to take a little bit of a longer look. I had lots of comments on some of the items. I think we don't have enough detail to really make an informed decision yet. I think we have too many mixed-use districts. I think the zoning illustrations are great, but need more work because they need more fleshing out. And I would like to suggest that we look at design review, corridor overlays. I don't understand how we can update the zoning while not updating the subdivision ordinance, the sign ordinance, or the parking ordinance, and I don't see any of that in the document today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members that are present in the room that would like to, any other members of the public that would like to offer comment? Do we have, I'm sorry, do we have anybody online that would like to offer comment? All right, we don't see anyone online, so we'll, at this time, we'll close the public comment period. Thank you all for taking the time to comment. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann, who's going to provide a recap of our last meeting, kind of set the tone for today's meeting. And, you know, I think it goes without saying that we're still kind of early in this process, and these documents, we're doing a lot of analysis. They're likely to change, you know, as we take deeper dives, have further information given to us by the consultants. So I want to be mindful of that we're not seeing final documents and, keep that in mind when we're taking comments in or we're looking at things, because it's definitely going to change as we continue this process. So just my little opening spiel, Mary Ann, if you want to get us kicked off for today.
Just really quickly, last month, for those of you who weren't here, the discussion in the pattern book was on the block scale level. I went through block scale at several of the different neighborhoods, kind of seeing the analysis that Carlos was doing at the block scale and how it may relate to the future zoning districts. Tonight, Carlos is going to go to details of the building scale level and design elements that might be important with the future zoning or maybe future other kinds of zoning tools that we might be looking at. So the building scale is tonight. In terms of the framework, we spent a lot of time, we learned about all these new zoning districts, and tonight we're going to take a deeper dive on those and having these small group discussions around them. So the questions we're going to be asking about, which I heard council members talking about, that Chamberlain Avenue question, do we all agree on that? Allowing you to have a smaller group facilitated discussion around some of those items. So we're going to, Renee is going to go into a little bit more detail about it, but it's a lot of questions. So hopefully we're able to get through them all in a short 15 minutes. That's it. Next month, again, they're going to be bringing back a lot of this information for you to look at again, based on the comments that they're hearing. We're also going to be bringing our engagement consultants back. I know it's been a while since we've talked engagement and how we're working with the community and the plan for next year. So they're going to be presenting with us the plan for next year in terms of engagement and having some of the working group conversations as well. The goal is in February is when we're going to be having bigger public community meetings on these draft districts. So we're going to be working a lot with you all to make sure we're getting it to a point that we can share more broadly with the public next February. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Mary Ann? I know that I've spoken to some folks and have heard around the room, questions about, are we looking at enough density and, where are we citing some of that density? And maybe because this meeting is going to be spent with a consultant presentation and then small group conversations, maybe at the beginning of the next meeting, if we could just maybe start off with just a general conversation amongst the committee on just any feedback they want to provide, or I know we're going to be doing that kind of small group, but it's been a while since we've had maybe just kind of an open discussion on where we are, where we're headed, what concerns we may have. I know I talked to Mr. Johannes about maybe some, looking at some of the transportation corridors. So just want to make sure that we're saving time to get all that incorporated in.
Great. Yeah, definitely. We can make time for that next one. And tonight you'll see, I'm going to put out all of your tables, a copy of the future land use map. I know it's hard for people that weren't a part of Richmond 300 to really know where all the land use categories are when we're talking districts in general. So it'll be, we don't have mapping of exactly in different districts, multiple districts for each future land use category, but it will still ground you a little bit more where the future land use was laid out in Richmond 300.
Any questions before we move on? All right, well, I'm going to kick it over to Renee Bieberstein and his team. Renee, can you hear us okay?
I can. I think, as usual, I'd like to start with Carlos, if that's okay, just to give us his presentation on the pattern book, and then we'll go over to the workshop portion and the discussion about the framework. That's okay.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Let me share my screen. 1 second. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So yes, as Marianne mentioned, right now we are on the last portion of the scale. So as a reminder, we've been going through from city to neighborhood to block to building. Last month when we presented the block scale, it was focused a lot on mostly on setbacks, and because it was the block scale was the first time we could actually do more qualitative and almost a parcel by parcel kind of survey, visual survey of the selected blocks. Based on that analysis, we identify some trends in building typology, which informed mostly how the property type that the zoning requires to define which minimums you have to comply. So either if you're attached or detached, if you're single, two-family, multifamily. So this is building, the building scale will build from that. So for the building scale, we look at three main components: the building frontage, how the building presents itself to the street, which includes which components it has, what is the elevation of the building with respect to its frontage, and what is the landscape of the front yard. We look again more in depth a little bit regarding the setbacks. What is the front setback range? How that relates to the building? What is side setbacks? And particularly what is the corner condition in some of these buildings? And finally, some character, mostly the fenestration and the roof line, which it was also part of a block analysis, but now we're going to have a more in-depth visualization of how it represents on the building. So we went back and forth on how to organize this building analysis. We didn't want to just survey building after building after building because it is it could be a never-ending task. But instead, we identify some of the key trends that we kept seeing, and in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show how these trends represent depending on the building type. The first type that we definitely had to include based on the prevailing pattern in most of the traditional neighborhoods of the city is the detached urban houses. These are houses that exist in different variances depending on where in the block, what's the elevation from the street, but overall they sit close to each other, sometimes too close that they touch each other. They're detached because they don't share a sidewall. They're typical three-window pattern, which is something that we'll see more in depth in a few slides. And there's always a porch of a stoop. Lots vary depending cases. So this is the most prevalent form in the older sections of Richmond. A two-story, sometimes three-story building, three-window pattern, as mentioned. This is something that we kept finding not just in Jackson Ware, but in Union Hill, Churchill North, the Fan, and even south south in Richmond. Like some new houses actually are replicating this pattern. The frontage includes a consistent. It has a consistent presence of a roof porch or a roof stoop. The average porch depth is between 5 and 6 feet. These are porches that encroach on the front yard, which is important for zoning. And the ground floor tends to be raised a few feet from the street. Setbacks in the front, in the particular case of Jackson Wharf, which is this example, range between 12 to 18 feet. The size setbacks, and it's something we covered on the block scale. In some cases, and the building, as seen here on the dash black line, the building sits right on the lot line, while the neighboring building has a narrow 3 to 4 side yard. Finally, for character, mostly flat roofs and an even amount of fenestration, with this window pattern again being a very relevant thing to note. These detached house has variances, and here we have a Union Hill and a Jackson Ware example where the ground floor is raised half a story, and this was covered partially on the block scale, but here we thought it was important to note as a part of a character within the detached urban houses. They're similar, like the previous one is against this consistent presence of a roof, in this case stoops, but there's cases where it becomes a porch. The only difference is that this porch or stoop is raised it's 5, 6 feet, maybe more, with the half story requiring going down on a stair to create this additional habitable space in the semi-basement. Setbacks various. The one in Union Hill that we see here is about 8 feet. The one in Jackson Ward is about 17. So that will depend. It's more about the presence of the structure and how it relates to the frontage with the stairs and the stoop. Roof lines. Some you could count this one as a gable as a mansard. It's hard to find, but at the end it's actually almost a shed kind of roof line with just this gable roof on the front. But overall, they tend to be shed roofs. There's been a back and forth about attach or detach, and this is important because the current zoning makes a lot of difference between both typologies, and based on that depends which regulations you need to follow, which minimums you need to cover. In this case, it seems like it is a better way to analyze this pattern as still a detached house that it just happens to touch each other. And this is after a back and forth regarding the sidewall. Buildings that have two different, that both sidewalls are not, there's two sidewalls, meaning that the sidewall is not shared. They are paired zoning, technically considered detached. And we'll see later a better example of why the attach and is different than this form. At the end, these are buildings that are still their individual roof porches and architectural elements are independent from each other. You can see how the three porches are separate from each other. They have their independent roofs, independent architectural styles. Frontage elevation, similar to the others. Third floor, done with a mansard. Side or corner facade, there's only one primary facade. The secondary facade has minimum amount of windows and no street side yard. And finally, one example from Museum District. This one, the interesting part is that the whole yard is raised and it has more landscape condition. There's technically a porch is not roofed, but it is a porch. It is, or a terrace. You could call it that, but there is this outdoor space that in some cases, like the neighbor on the back, that is grayed out. There's a porch in there, but the amenity space and the relationship with the street is still there. So the detached versus the attached. For the attached ones, it is very similar to the ones that we just saw, with the difference that it is a continuous building across different parcels. The building massing sits in different parcels and they share a sidewall. So if we go to how this expresses itself on the building scale, once again, the 3-window pattern, this was a constant almost everywhere that we were looking to this similar type of buildings. But here you can see it's a building that is built as a unit, but it sits in two parcels. The parcel line actually runs right in the middle of the building, which also produces a change of material and color between partitions. And the other thing is the porch that I mentioned, how the previous example had separate porches and it really expressed itself as 3 different buildings. Here is one continuous porch, one continuous roof that it just split in 2 parcels. In front yard, side yards is relatively similar. Side facades, it's a low fenestration, which repeats when it happens to be a corner. It does the same thing. It doesn't really create a secondary facade of any kind. This example from Jackson Ward is similar in that it's 4 different units, 4 different parcels, but it feels like a continuous building. Each partition, 3 windows. So we're talking, and you can see how the porch is also a continuous architectural language across the different parcels. So that would be like the main difference between this and the detached version that we saw. This is also important because the attached typology or these attached houses tend to sit on narrower lots. These lots tend to be 16, 15 feet sometimes, which we'll see the next one in example in Oregon Hill, even narrower. But overall, it's similar, and they're similar across different neighborhoods. This Oregon Hill example is it's like the previous one, but more compact. We're talking about parcel size are 14 feet, 13 feet, some cases. Because it's narrower, we lost one window. It is very interesting how it really is just like the building losing some frontage and then it lost a window, but it is still the same kind of language. And even though the porch seems to have different architectural detailing, the porch roof is continuing across both of the parcels. So it's similar to the other two attached ones that we saw. The other particular case in Oregon Hill is how, unlike other neighborhoods that we were looking, the ground floor is raised less from the street, so 1 foot, maybe 2 in some cases, but it is lower and sits closer to the street than other examples. And finally, a few other examples is the walk-up buildings. These are apartment buildings, 2-3 stories. Very interesting pattern where we kept finding a entrance right in the middle, a main entrance right in the middle with a porch and balconies stacked on top of each other on each side of that entrance. That was a pattern that was repetitive on the museum district and some fan apartment buildings. But also we saw similar newer buildings trying to replicate this form in places like Union Hill. The range of setbacks matches the other building, the surrounding building. So there is a range. It's not necessarily attached to the building type of the building pattern itself. But this combo of porch, balcony, entrance in the middle is for sure a very distinctive pattern. Finally, the roof line, the presence of some cross gables or some accents in the corners, or the architectural base to create some symmetry in the building. The other big building type that is probably the most common building type across all most of residential areas in Richmond is the detached house. Now, detached houses can come in so many shapes and forms, and instead of trying to decipher every single pattern, every single type of house, what we thought it was important is to identify some key elements that make these houses, how they project themselves to the streets and how they relate to their neighbors. So important elements here is, of course, unlike the more urban detached house, the side yards are wider, so they're more distinguishable between properties. You can see the yard on each side. Houses are 1 to 2 stories. Detached houses typically are still the end accessed by a stoop or a porch, and front yards there's a wide range of front yards depending neighborhoods. So, for example, the example in Churchill North, very interesting juxtaposition between a 1-story ranch-style house that is several decades old to a new construction, 2 stories, a bit denser, raised from the street by this elevated porch, but shed roof and the prison bay windows. But it actually is pretty similar to some of the other more denser typologies that I just covered. But this juxtaposition between a 1-story and 2-story is very present across neighborhoods. This is in Oak Grove. which also has some old two-story buildings, but all the new construction that is happening there, well, I want to say old, but a lot of the new construction that we keep identifying in this in the neighborhood, where these 2 stories houses juxtaposed next to these smaller 1-story houses. And again, porches and stoops. That's pretty much. It was very hard to find, or we barely saw any example where there was no stoop or porch in the building. This last example from Washington Park, same story. 1-story. This is I think this is a newer home that replaced an older, similar shaped house, and then the two-story buildings, also of new construction. In this case, interestingly, they're narrow parcels. They're substandard, meaning that their yards are also narrower than the average detached house, and they have this combo of mansard/shed roof condition and the 3-window pattern that new construction other places in the city is kind of like replicating this historical DNA. And the final building pattern that we wanted to point out is this general commercial buildings, especially the ones that happens in residential areas. These buildings do not follow the front setback, and this is something we point out on the block scale. But I think it is important to know when these buildings and buildings that if there's buildings that have mixed uses, they tend to get built right at the sidewalk level. And we can see in this photo how both neighbors are residential uses. Both neighbors are set back. They have a front yard. The one on the right has a porch, and the one on the left has some porch and stairs. But these mixed-use commercial, or that used to be commercial, I don't know if it's in this particular case is used, but with a shop front on the ground floor is sitting right on the sidewalk. So this is an interesting pattern, especially when for the future zoning regarding mixed use and how this is going to present itself in terms of building form. And that will be it for in terms of building patterns. Overall, like this is a mix of some numbers that we believe this will inform the future zoning, but also some qualitative quasi-architectural patterns that we thought it was important to identify, which makes the neighborhoods that we analyze that provide the character to those neighborhoods. And I'm happy to take any questions about this.
Do you have any questions for Carlos? Brian?
I'd have to flip back to where the my question originally arose, but when you have pictures of some of the Jackson Ward properties and on that page here, page 7, the end building, the note is no side street facade, north yard, minimum windows. Is there a reason that you would want minimum windows? Or I mean, I'm fine with it being allowed, but why? There's no reason we wouldn't want somebody to have as many windows as they want, right?
So it is important to say that for the pattern book, like we're not saying if something is desirable or not. It's just identifying that in most of these buildings, when they sit on the corner, that's the condition, right? Like across, if you most of the buildings in with corner condition will have one actual facade, and the other one will be just a sidewall with some minimum windows.
So you're just describing current conditions. You're not
Correct.
suggesting
Correct.
that's the way it ought to be.
It will be the job of like the rezoning to decide if that's a pattern that it's allowed, still continue to be allowed, it is tolerated, or is encouraged, that or not encouraged, will come next.
I have a question. Sure. Is it, and this is about detached urban houses and then attached urban houses
Hmm.
that to a casual observer like me would, passing by would look the same.
Yeah.
Is there now, or has there been in the past, a fire safety or some other health and safety reason why it was preferable to have detached urban houses abutting one another versus essentially one building sharing walls?
That would be a question for probably somebody else in the city. I don't. I'm not an expert on code on that realm.
Kevin, do you know, I mean, did the fire department prefer to see detached buildings versus?
Yeah, I mean,
Like whenever I go to Oregon Hill, I say, golly, I don't know that.
It really boils down to construction techniques. So if you take two houses and they're abutting, I know that the city refers to those differently than if they're attached and connected.
Yeah.
However, when we're building basically, let's say townhouses and things like that, they are built to be independent structures, even though they look like they're totally under one roof, attached that way. And the modern convention techniques is just to deal with that. So that wall between them is still supposed to have a certain level of fire protection. The wall between two houses that are abutting are also supposed to have that same fire protection.
So it's the same, using modern materials and techniques, it's the same safety factor.
And then there might be some sort of zoning discussions going on in terms of how that's being perceived, but that's something that's just partially an open discussion when it comes to, let's say,
Okay.
sprinkler or not sprinkler safety.
I'm gonna put Charlie on the spot for a minute. Did you have anything to add to that? I know that you encounter this often in your cases and the zoning building code issues that.
Yes, I mean, that's all embodied in the building code, right? Like the fire department
Building code.
isn't the
Fire
one enforcing that, it's the building department. Yeah, I mean, modern buildings require to meet modern building code, so it's kind of built into that regardless of what zoning happens to say about something. Only one part of the equation, you still have to respect the building code, and zoning doesn't supersede that.
Get Roger, then Damien, then Reed.
The zoning ordinance currently distinguishes between two houses built separately that are abutting and two houses that were built at the same time with a party wall down the middle. If there's a party wall down the middle, each one can add on and back up to the property line. If they're abutting, they can't. So that's something to keep in mind as we work our way through supplemental regulations.
That's a strange nuance when you think about it.
You guys kind of already answered my question. I was sort of unfamiliar with this concept of detached but adjoining houses. Like I would just consider that attached. I thought that those two words meant the same thing, but apparently they don't. So that's.
And yeah, this was some conversation that Brian and I had several times to when is something attached and when something detached. It's, like this one, for example, to me was hard to identify and definitely create some zoning challenges where if these were counted as detached houses per zoning, their lot width is substandard. If they're counted as attached single family houses, they are within the allowed lot width. So there's a lot of nuance of when something is attached or detached and how it is counted per zoning. So the single family attached requires 16 feet. The single family detached requires 50, if I'm not mistaken. And the same goes for use. These two houses look the same. The one on the right is a single family, just one mailbox you can see here. The other in the middle has two mailboxes. It's a 2-unit. It's at least a 2-family. So by being 2-family, it's non-conforming versus the one on the right that will be conforming just because different rules for different intensities. So that's another. Again, not saying if it's good or bad. It's just the pattern that is in there and how this could inform the zoning and deciding which numbers to what uses to what intensity.
So the houses you chose were all ones that were part of those original 10 areas, and that's why these are the ones that were chosen?
Can you repeat the question?
So the buildings you chose to analyze, are they only in the original 10 areas that you did the pattern book on?
Yes, we took examples from the neighborhoods that we did the block scale analysis. Also, it's um not, and remembering that also the neighborhoods that we choose was mostly focused on R5, R6, R7, R63. You could add there R8 as well as the more the denser section of the residential districts. We did have one at R4 and in West Hampton, but the R1, R2, R3s were not included in this analysis. Not saying that there's no other patterns that would be relevant in those areas.
I guess, but the question mainly, like, how does this analysis help inform the zoning districts? And kind of related to that is like, there are a lot, I mean, I don't see like my housing type here where I currently live. And like, I bet there's a lot of other people who may not see their housing type in Richmond. So it's just like, I don't know, kind of, or even when I drive around Richmond, there's like a lot of other types of houses that exist that aren't shown here. So I'm just wondering, like, how does this inform the zoning category?
It is also important noting that when we start at the city scale, we start zooming in on the areas where more nonconformities were being pointed out. So areas where the amount of nonconformities were lower meant that the current building form and the current zoning were pretty much aligned. It was the areas where there was patterns that the current zoning could not inform, where we start focusing our efforts, trying to understand what patterns is the current zoning missing to take into account that could inform the new zoning. I don't know, Renee, if you have any follow-up in there.
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit. Yeah, I think that the purpose of the pattern book in particular was to understand some of the patterns that really define the traditional neighborhoods of Richmond that have historically been, as Carlos said, out of conformity with the zoning that's been imposed on them. So our hope is that the new zoning, when we work through the update, is that a lot of those nonconformities will be removed, and you'll be able to build buildings that are more like some of these historic patterns in those areas without having to go through elaborate special use permit processes. And so part of what we want to understand is what are those metrics that define those neighborhoods. And so I guess the question is, yeah, seeing this quite detailed analysis that Carlos has put together, are we going to bake all of these metrics into the zoning? And how tightly are we going to restrict that? The intent of the zoning is not to kind of service something like a historic district. It's not supposed to be that restrictive, but it is supposed to, again, accommodate some of the traditional forms in those neighborhoods where it appears. And I think it's up to us now to determine how we're going to respond to this analysis in terms of the zoning. So it's still to be determined. I think what you've seen presented in the last meeting was a very, very simple kind of high level kind of approach to zoning, just to put something in front of you. There's a lot of potential additional metrics that could come out of this. For example, roof types, entrance types. We talked a lot about porches just now, elevations of the ground floor, floor to floor elevations. Some of those things, fenestration, some of those sort of things could go into zoning, and they do in other places. So I think it's up to us now, and I think that could be part of the discussion today, is to, which of those metrics are really important to bake into zoning, which we should be perhaps looser about.
In terms of the attached and the duplex versus the single family, something that I noticed in presentation last week or last month, the R5, they show, I believe it's a 50-foot wide lot, and you have a duplex there, and a duplex is exactly the attached two single family houses that we're looking at other neighborhoods. So what I'm having a little bit of difficulty in is that if we have this 50-foot wide district and we have duplexes allowed, and we create two single family houses in appearance at every single lot, then all we're doing is creating a bunch of duplex attached houses in pairs in a different district. So I'm having a little difficulty defining that, because just an easy way to say, well, I'm just going to put two houses there, we'll condo it, which is kind of getting around the idea of having a duplex and creating a pair of houses. Does that make sense?
You're saying that it sort of is effectively just like splitting the lot width in two, rather than
Yeah,
having
you
two
just, you
units
took
on
the
a
lot
lot.
line, it's like that, you could put that little lot line in and out of there, and you're saying, well, we have 50 feet, but we're creating 225s out of it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is, a point for discussion, whether we think this is a good idea or not. I think this is, we're hoping to hear back from you guys, as to how you feel about this. Right now, I think as we said before, you can already do ADUs on these lots, although their scale is limited relative to the main building. Is the jump from that ADU up to two buildings of the same size potentially, a desirable or a non-desirable jump to make? I guess this is a question for us to discuss.
Is your question geared towards, right now, I feel like we spend a lot of time treating differently, right? Attached and detached abutting, right? Like we spend so much time, but again, I think, and as you said, from the casual observer, can't tell the construction unless you're going inside. And so I think you're trying to get to like, at the end of the day, what does the new code provide for in terms of just real bare minimum width per unit?
Potentially, or just, I'm just having a difficult time defining all the houses that look like the attached houses from the tighter district compared to the 50-foot wide lot district. Because we could just be making the exact same thing and selling them the exact same way with a little nuance of a condo.
Right. Well, and I think maybe back to the building code question about building code techniques and what is, right? And I'll say an overarching thing, right? What is most economical to get housing units produced has this question. And I think going back to the discussion, and I'll admit, right? We've spent a lot of time on particular districts, but going back to, the diagnosis is like, why is zoning not working in these particular areas, right? Why do we have so many special use permits? Why have we identified so many conformities? And as we're getting into it, part of it is becoming on this construction piece. But I think to add like building new, like, should that matter?
Well, the part I'm having difficulty with is if we're creating something where we can put 225s and in a district that has 50s, why are we going through the effort of building the 225s versus the 50?
Mm-hmm.
And I understand we have 50-foot wide lot.
I feel like it's a question, like the spectrum of, I think what we're considering is, are we using this as like a permissive exercise or a requirement exercise? Like we might have that philosophical discussion of like zoning should be more permissive and people can figure it out. Or are we having a discussion of like, we want buildings heretofore to mimic the historic development pattern and we're going to require that?
I'm
Like
just
that's-
having a conflict, philosophical
right.
conflict. We're building the 25s, but we're going to be calling it a 50, a 50 pair. And it's just 225s everywhere.
Yeah, but maybe you have the 225s and it's like, oh, I can do duplexes here. Maybe I can structure them in an abutting duplex manner that I have 4 dwelling units, right? That's where it's, I understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah, so just to be clear, in terms of what we're proposing, we're talking about potentially duplexes on those lots. We haven't yet spoken to kind of like the design of those duplexes. I think that's, up for discussion right now, whether they're vertically or horizontally separated or how they're arranged in the lot. So, will it look like 2 houses beside each other, effectively sort of splitting the lot in 2? I guess that's one possible outcome. But if that's not desirable, then we can take other approaches. There's also going to be setbacks and other things that are going to limit what you can do there, potentially maximum building length. So
it's also partially if we were looking at form base, we wouldn't necessarily see the difference between the form base of the 2 different zoning districts in this case.
We're gonna have time to digest this and break this down a little bit more, and it's great conversation, but we're getting behind on the agenda, and I know we have a group exercise. So, if not correct, Marion, we're gonna have time to take a deeper dive into this and have a conversation. Yeah, okay. So, unless there's anybody that's dying to get something out, I wanna, if we're at the end of Carlos's presentation, I wanna move us into the group exercise. Are we gonna have,
Renee had the brief.
yeah, If you don't mind, I'm just going to share a couple slides first. It's not a presentation, it's just introducing the exercise.
Great.
Yeah, I think, yeah, last time you heard a lot from us, so I'm hoping we can finally turn it over to you and really have a good time for discussion. I know we're a little bit over time already, so I'd like to try and jump into this as soon as we can. But just to kind of introduce you, you've already heard the pattern book. Just to give you a very brief update on the zoning framework. These are some things that we heard from the kind of the brief discussion we had at the end of the last meeting, where we had our presentation of the sort of first presentation of this kind of initial palette of zoning districts. Some adjustments that we're thinking about making, but these are still just for discussion today, based on what we heard from you last time. You know, possibility of under the residential category here, removing the RE, which was the sort of the very deep front setback district that we talked about before. For example, on Chamberlain Avenue, we heard earlier in this meeting today that maybe there are some who like that. So again, this is a question for discussion, but do we need that sort of deep front setback option in residential? Another possibility, we had sort of proposed a limiting of commercial size in the RX residential mixed use districts. Do we need that limit? We heard from a person last time, a member, that maybe that limit wasn't necessary. So maybe getting rid of that. We heard also about the possibility of needing a kind of more auto-oriented, let's say, or more suburban option in the commercial mixed use categories. All the ones we have so far are very urban in nature. And obviously we like those, and we think that's aligned to the general vision of the plan, but are there some places where in the short to medium term, we're going to need to have, let's say, a better suburban approach as opposed to going all the way to a kind of full-on urban approach? So possibility of one or more districts being added there. And then possibility of maybe striking a couple of the industrial mixed use. It seemed like a lot of industrial mixed use districts. Maybe we could sort of flatten some of those down and make it a bit simpler. Probably the kind of the tallest ones would maybe just be regular commercial mixed use. So those are just a few thoughts we had after that sort of initial discussion that we had last time. Our hope is that after this, more fulsome discussion today, we'll come back with a kind of revised palette of draft zones in January, and we can present that to you and have another discussion on it then. So in terms of the workshop today, I know we've got only just a little over an hour left. What I'm hoping that we can do, if this works, we might need to compact this given the number of people who are here today, but the thought was that we would divide into 4 different groups. One of those groups could be remote because we have a couple members who are joining us remotely, and have a staff person, at least a staff person or a consultant in each one of these groups to join in the discussion. I've divided sort of the discussion into 4 different parts with separate questions, and I'm hoping we could spend, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes each on each one of these at least, and try to move through them, and then have at least a very brief report back at the end, just so that we don't feel like we ended the discussion not understanding what everybody else was getting at. I'm hoping we can just have a little bit of a kind of return back. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes, but just a brief report back. So I'm hoping that somebody in each one of these groups can take some notes and be ready to kind of just give a brief summary of where the group landed on some of these questions. In terms of the questions, I'm just going to read through these really briefly. The first group here, just general questions about the structure of the code and sort of the way it's the nomenclature. Are the zoning district names, abbreviations, and groupings clear to everybody? And again, I'm going to ask you for all these questions to refer back to the slides that were presented during the last meeting, which I think everybody has had a copy of. At least those who are physically in the meeting should have a hard copy in front of you. Others who are here remotely should be able to should have downloaded or be able to download the PDF version of the last presentation. Are the ABC style prefixes for some of the zones appropriate? Does it make sense to call the zoning districts to call some zoning districts mixed use or others not? For example, RDX is mostly residential, but includes some limited mixed uses. RB might even include some very limited mixed uses. So for example, places of worship, small daycares, public uses, home businesses, etc. Richmond 300 used mixed use in many, but not all of its land use categories. So this is just kind of a nomenclature thing, but just would like to hear back from you on this. Are the commercial mixed use and industrial mixed use groupings clear? Just to be clear, both of these would actually allow fully residential buildings in there. So just wanted to hear back from you if you think those titles make sense, or if we should have any other suggestions for how what to name them. So far, the only key defining standards that have been presented, so far only key defining standards have been presented for each mixed use district. Are there any other standards that you think are important to discuss up front? So this gets back to the kind of discussion we just had about the pattern book. We just kind of presented just a few kind of key defining standards for each one of these districts, but are there other things that you really want us to kind of bake into them right away? We're going to get to more standards later on, but are there any other ones you really want to talk about upfront? So it could be building coverage, amenity space, side or rear setbacks. We only really talked about front setbacks so far. It could be other things that came up in the pattern book, like porches or roofs or windows as well. So just wanted to put that out there to you. Second discussion on residential. Most of the zoning districts we presented in November have been discussed at earlier meetings. So again, these should be no surprise to you, but any new reactions at this point? Just want to check again on people's level of comfort with allowing duplexes in RB and RC, and that may relate to what was just raised now. Maybe we limit them, or maybe it's only a certain kind of duplex. I just want to hear more from you about this because it is a bit of a big change potentially. Last time it was suggested that there might need to be a new zoning district or districts between RC and RD, because it seems like a bit of a jump on the face of it, going up from 2 units per lot up to as many as 12 units if the lot was large enough to accommodate it. Do you agree on having something else between these two, or do you think it's okay? It was also suggested last time that the RE zone, which requires that big front setback along Chamberlain Road, for example, be eliminated. Do you agree? Other places in the city outside of RA, RB, and RC where a large front setback should be required for some reason. And then the other question about commercial unit size in RX and RDX. I raised that already. For the commercial mixed use zones, this is the third discussion. Most of those CX zoning districts are currently designed to be applied all the way across the Richmond 300 categories of community mixed use, corridor mixed use, destination mixed use, and downtown mixed use, being distinguished mostly by their heights. Is that appropriate in your mind, or do you think that we need to have, is there something else about those categories that requires a more tailored approach? Do we need to have specific community mixed use or corridor or destination mixed use or downtown mixed use districts only that appear only in that area? And maybe based on the comment that we heard earlier today, I could throw nodes into the mix there as well and say, when you get to a node, is it simply that you're selecting a different zone in the map, and maybe it's a more intensive zone from the same palette, or is there some sort of specific node zone that we should be considering that's not part of the the palette you've already seen? So there's a question for you. And all the districts that we present so far are urban, and I think this is just a question about suburban or more auto-oriented commercial mixed use. Do we think that we need a zone like that in the short to medium term? And do we need more than one? And where would you apply those if we were to apply them? And then finally, the last discussion here, this is about the other categories, industrial and industrial mixed use. Again, we're suggesting maybe reducing the number of industrial mixed use districts from what we originally proposed. Are 2 sufficient? Could they be consolidated further? Do you have any concerns about the compatibility of light industrial and other uses? We haven't yet done a kind of full use table that kind of explains in detail all the kind of different uses that would be allowed or not allowed each one of these. Are there some compatibility issues you have around thinking about industrial and things like residential and the industrial mixed use area? Some could express concern last time, but we need to establish a better public realm in formerly industrial areas. What are your top priorities? I think we heard a bit about this before, but just would like to hear from you again. What are your top priorities about establishing a better public realm? Wider sidewalks, more plantings, more green space, setbacks, anything else that you'd like to sort of see in these areas in the zoning. And then the other districts, is there a need for a special campus district when it comes to institutional, or are we okay with a single civic district? And do we have any concerns about the new open space districts? Are 2 enough? Does it need to be more? We wondered about cemeteries. Those don't seem to really fit neatly into those 2 open space categories. We have some for. Do we need to have a special cemetery district, or could we kind of write those into one of the 2 that we have right now? So just a couple more kind of general thoughts. Those are the discussions. So I'm hoping we can sort of jump right into it and then have a quick report back before the end of this meeting. Just to reiterate the next steps, and I think this was mentioned by Marianne already. When we get to January, we're going to kind of come back with some revised conceptual zoning districts, responding to the discussion we had today and anything else we hear from you guys. We're going to do a bit of testing on mapping and show you maybe a couple neighborhoods with some sample maps just to sort of see how this might play out and get your take on that. We're going to have more discussion on all this, hopefully. The pattern book will be available as a complete draft at that point, so you'll be able to take a look at that. And not on this page here, but I think Marianne also mentioned we're going to be presenting the kind of engagement plan for the next year and the kind of the timeline for the next year at that point. So you'll be able to see where we're going beyond these next couple months. In February, there'll be the public open house and the panel events on the focus on housing. And in March, we're going to be actually diving into the detailed zoning districts and zoning maps. So based on everything we've heard so far. So I'm going to wrap this up right now and turn this back over for the workshop portion of today. Thank you,
So I
guys.
think we're gonna keep in our 4 groups, since we have less time and only 3 people per group, everyone will have a chance to talk more. And then
Right.
Renee, I'm gonna stick, you're gonna facilitate the online group. I have at least 2
Excellent.
members of the advisory council that are gonna join there. Everybody at their desk should have a copy of the future land use map that'll help you understand where the districts are kind of aligned with the future land use map. At least 1 copy of the November presentation. I have 2 other extra ones and we've got a couple of computers that copies of the questions, and also we have staff members at the helping you facilitate. I'm gonna quickly try to.
Just remember, we're a little bit behind schedule, so try to keep the conversation moving because I want to have time, if we can, to report back because last time we had to push the report back to the next meeting, and you can already tell there's a packed agenda for January. So let's try to be mindful of the time. We're going to stop at 5:40. Okay.
I'll send it to you in the next line.
Kevin.
Nice. 9 minutes, please.
Yeah, well, some of, I don't have that.
Why don't we, why don't you?
R3 to R5.
One of the.
D, R6 to R8. D, next. R6 to R8.
Marianne, are you able to put me into a breakout group?
All right, well, let's jump in.
Having
district names.
Or, mute.
Move A, B, C, D.
Give me a second.
Yeah. So I didn't have a problem with
And
letters.
my response to
The
the
A, B, C.
first question would be the same as the second, which is,
Okay, great. Online folks, can you hear me? Okay, great. So I guess we're just going to have the discussion as is. And let me share my screen again.
They might be able to hear you.
Let me go back to the beginning here. Okay. Are either of you guys
Hey, Marianne, can you hear me? Or anybody? I just need to be put in the breakout.
little hoarse, but we're gonna keep rolling. So let's get a report out from each of the groups. And Kevin, do you mind if we deputize you to be our keeper of the time?
Sure.
You're doing a great job with that.
Yep.
So if Kevin starts giving you the evil eye, you know, it's time to move on.
Hold on 1 second. I forgot to kick the people out of the. Sorry, Preston. The online.
So why don't we start with Roger and the table over here. Who's going to
We
be?
solved all the problems.
Is that good?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, this is gonna be fast. General discussion question one. We think that this should be kind of sorted out at the end, defer that decision until later. Number two, if any mix of uses allowed, that should be clear in the nomenclature and category. So not a specific answer there, but yes, we do like having some sort of distinction between a residential that does allow mixed use and residential that doesn't. Are the groupings clear? Yes. Number four, we didn't have an answer for. Moving on to the residential discussion. We are comfortable with allowing duplexes in RB and RC, but some of the types of zoning districts that I think there was a concern that some of the like lower density current zoning districts that are slated for RB might not be appropriate for duplexes, but generally speaking, everything else is. As far as whether we need something in between C and D, one school of thought that I propose is that C itself should be changed to allow 4 units. Thus, we won't need any sort of further distinctions. If we don't do that, which also gets to the point of if RC allows 4 units, then we have to interrogate what becomes RC. Where does that go on the map? But if not, then perhaps a different district in between C and D is warranted. No answer for residential 3. For residential 4, we don't see the need for the limit of 2,500 square feet. Commercial.
On residential, or you want to do each 4?
That's a good idea.
I'm sorry, I just.
No, you're rolling. You guys are now the best practice and how you keep on time. You're doing great. What do you think, Kevin? Should we move it around?
Just let's go through each of them so no one gets to talk.
Sure.
Make sure we get to it. So
All right.
2 minutes, so it's good. So 2 minutes for residential.
Okay.
Charlie, Maritza.
For residential. Oh, we skipped it on. Sorry. We didn't think that duplexes in RV would fine, which is better to keep the. We didn't think that duplexes in RV would fly and it would be better just to keep the accessory dwelling units as is. We also didn't really think that people would be building them anyway, so it's okay. A lot of those lots are really large. You can probably subdivide them now anyway and do 2 units if you wanted. But we should probably allow it in RC. We were kind of split. We're not sure that I was not sure that anyone would be building 12-unit buildings, so I didn't really know if that was like worth having in the zoning district. Charlie was like, allow it and see where it goes. Damien's proposal of having that the RC have 4, I mean, that might get you in the right spot. I think that if you made all of the fan RD with 12 units as a max, people would be pretty concerned. And then I was like, maybe we shouldn't get rid of the RE. There probably is a place for it in the city. And then on the RX, we don't think you should limit the size of the commercial use, which then made us start to think about, do you need an RX and a CX if you can do fully residential in CX? And you're not required to do ground floor retail in the CX. So I was like, I don't know if you need the differentiation. And then for RX, for RDX, where you can have 25,000 square foot maximum size, we thought that felt fine. And Charlie was like, what if there was a provision that the BZA could grant a special exception of the use is over 2,500 square feet? I don't know if that's something that normally happens. I don't go to the BZA, thank God, very often. So There you go.
Great. All right, another table.
So our group had a similar reaction. Generally comfortable, but we think it's more likely in RC to occur. So stick with duplexes in RC, not in RV. On the 2 to 12 story, we said no, you're limited in height of 4 stories. So whether you've got between 2 and 12 stories, we didn't think there needed to be a third category. On the large front yard setback, we said we should not encourage a large front yard setback. The limitation of size in retail, we said no, it should be up to the building design. I think it's just setting it up for a loophole or a subpar design of the building with random space outside of that 2,500 square feet on both accounts. We also think in RDX, there should not be a minimum setback.
All right, on this group, on the first one, we had one opposed to duplexes in B and C, that's me, and then 2 undecided. My point is that I think Richmond 300 got this right. What Richmond 300 says is that residential would not allow duplexes except as secondary uses. Secondary uses are specifically described as being along major roads. So I think the focus on putting duplexes in residential areas should be along the major streets identified in Richmond 300. This was not something that was, this was, if it was a compromise, it was something that was put in place with a lot of input from a lot of people. So I think that's where we ought to draw the line, stick with Richmond 300. Others were undecided, and it's obviously debatable. The next one, I think where we came out is it's okay to allow more density over RC. I think. Okay. Chamberlain, we talked about it. I'm not sure exactly where we ended up, but I don't know that we saw a reason to
None of us
maintain
will hold
those big setbacks. And then finally, I think we like at least 3 of the groups. Number 4, we thought let the market decide the minimum size for retail in a mixed building.
Great. I think we'll do the next lap then. Let's do,
Kevin,
what do you say, the commercial?
There's
online.
though unfortunately it was impossible for me to get Casey into. I think it's just Eric. Renee or Eric?
Eric, you want to speak to
Sure.
what you got to say?
Yeah, these are all my personal opinions. Yeah, I was obviously very comfortable with duplexes in RB and RC. I don't feel there's any need for additional gradation between RC and RD. And then comfortable with eliminating the RE zone. And then I think, just like was just said, I don't think there's any need for a 2,500 square foot maximum. I believe the market will decide that.
All right.
Let's take a lap then on commercial. And I would just say, for those of you who haven't written things down, write them down because we can collect them then for the stuff that we don't get to. But I think let's do a lap on commercial. Does that sound good? Okay. All right. You don't have to go the same order. We can go different order if somebody else wants to go first to lead. Otherwise, we will.
I'll just go.
All right, go.
Yeah, so for the first question, I think we had trouble wrapping our heads around it. I think we generally feel like that the height should match what is in Richmond 300. The future land use designations. On 2, we talked about this for a while, and I think what we landed on was that we do think it's appropriate to continue allowing auto-oriented uses on major corridors outside of the nodes that are designated Richmond 300, and particularly a concern about not wanting to have new auto-oriented uses built in locations of potential future BRT stops.
Thank you.
We thought that some neighbors would freak out if you allow CX8 and community mixed use areas. So I think that's where kind of figuring out which zones would be allowed to go for community mixed use was more of a concern. there might be places, I guess, where it would be appropriate to map CX3 to a destination mixed use area, although I'm not really sure that's what we wanted to encourage. In the master plan, when it was like generally a minimum of 5 stories, totally aligned. So there might be, it might be worth kind of revising some of these alignments. And yes, we think we need a suburban or auto-oriented district that has some form requirements to make sure that, like, you know, driveways are placed in good spots or whatever. Drive-throughs.
Our answer to the first question was not necessarily. We didn't get too far in the details there. We also agreed that there should be a auto-oriented district, thinking though that that would apply to larger users. So potentially having that be allowed for 10,000 square foot to 15,000, thinking particularly for the south side on trying to attract the larger grocery store user or big box.
Yep. Oh, me? I didn't really write any notes down.
Well, I think we had similar responses on the auto-oriented uses. And I mean, the reality that I'm just repeating something Preston said, you're not going to get a Starbucks unless you drive it. So it doesn't, you just have to face that. And if you want development in areas where it would be good to have development, you just have to allow it. But it's inappropriate in other tighter areas. The first one, like you, Jennifer, I don't think we got into all the nuances about all of them. It just strikes me as having 5. There's probably some way of combining some of those to make it a little bit more condensed. But I expressed the thought that you probably need in community areas that are adjacent to residential areas, you probably needed something that's less intensive than other areas, just to transition from.
All right, Eric.
I'll be quick about this. I was felt that was fairly appropriate for the first question. I'm fine with that. And then with the second question, my inclination here is, you know, just to plan for the future here. I don't necessarily feel a need for suburban oriented uses. You know, once those things are built, they're harder to get rid of in the future. So let's plan for the future that we want.
All right, I think we're going to do one more lap. And this is potpourri, anything, one thing, 1 minute, but you just like need to make sure it gets out there because it's genius or you're very passionate about it. So everyone can pick one thing, 1 minute from any of the questions.
One thing that came up at our table was kind of light industrial compatibility with other uses. And there was concern that light industrial can kind of diminish a neighborhood if it's like a warehouse that's like really empty and nobody's around, or like a storage, just like a self-storage facility, like kind of right next to your house. Like those kind of uses may not really be appropriate with residential. So there were some concerns about that.
A very particular type of use.
Yeah,
storage.
just like no, just like
Warehousing.
light industrial in
Yeah, okay.
general might not be kept up as much.
We might have interpreted the question differently. I think we had no concerns about compatibility with the other types of uses that are envisioned in the IX zones. That's the page that we were on here.
I'll jump in just because it's sort of a unique question. We looked at the question about should there be a special campus district within institutional, or is this single civic district enough? And I pointed to a couple examples where I'd seen that reality arise in the current limitation arise in the current zoning ordinance, and how there would be some benefit to having a little bit of flexibility within the institutional that it doesn't currently have. So having those two diverging bits would probably be useful.
I think the word civic connotes it's like open to anyone who in the public domain. And like, that's not true for a lot of the institutional uses on city now. So that would at least have there be like difference, or maybe civic should be called institutional instead.
Right now, institutional has a minimum acreage also.
Right.
Yeah.
So very few places in the city that have 10 acres.
Yeah.
I don't know about the rest of my, I have a concern about the open space districts, just as a general threshold matter. The city had a provision at one point in time in their master plan where if there was a space identified as being appropriate for open space, and it slowed down your plan of development review, that the General Assembly came in and told the city that you can't do stuff like that. So it just makes me nervous that there's a city potential district that could be a city-initiated rezoning, identifying private property as open space.
I think the intent was that it would only be public property, that would be open space.
Yeah, I
That's
think
fine.
correct.
The question of private open space did come up in the last meeting. And it strikes, to me, I think that there, we have these issues with these alley infill locations that are treated as open space and treated as like the public domain, and then all of a sudden we remember that they're private and somebody wants to build on them.
Yes.
And everyone always just says, let's keep it open space. So having an opportunity, maybe you don't actually place this designation anywhere, but having a designation that exists whereby if people want to buy a grassy lot in the museum district and make it open space forever, they can do so.
Put a conservation easement on it.
Well, there's a minimum 50 acre, but some
Yeah.
are kind of a
Something.
version. It would be kind of our local version.
Yeah.
Right.
Eric, you have something?
Yeah, I just want to call the attention, whether that or bring to question whether the institutional district will allow for residential uses moving forward. I just wanted to, flag, the General Assembly bill that's going, the Faith and Housing bill, and then also, you're seeing cities develop affordable housing of their own. The city of Chicago has developed multifamily above libraries, and what a wonderful thing that would be to see the city of Richmond build affordable housing above its libraries. So just want to put that out there.
I like that.
Thank
Bringing
you.
this thing in for a landing right here at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Nicely done. Stand adjourned.
Thanks.
If you were a Scrivener, please get your comments, Mary Ann.
Thank you. Maritza emailed me yours. Y'all got
You have oh yeah, I guess you got an email. You've got a clean copy.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
and the intent is for the next meeting to be here at